Second part book continuation of the first part The Baron's AD/Inchers with a Fox and a Boar Chapter 12. More of the Baron's adventures at sea when Captain Phipps, the present Lord Mulgrave, went on a voyage of discovery to the North Pole. I accompanied him not as an officer, but as a friend. We passed Spitzbergen safely, nothing but sea and sky and immense icebergs, some of them 3 times as high as our masts. I took my telescope and began gazing at the objects round us, for I consider it very helpful to look round from time to time when travelling in order to miss nothing of interest. On the nearest iceberg, which I was about a mile away, I saw 2 large polar apparently engaged in a deadly fight. I immediately took my rifle and ivoked across the ice, but the ascent to the summit was exceedingly toilsome and dangerous. At times I was obliged to leap over immense chasms, at others, I had to crawl over a surface as smooth as a mirror, and it took me some time to reach the bears, who after all were only at play. I at once began to calculate the value of their skins, for each bear was as large as a well-fed ox. Unfortunately, as I was to fire, my right foot slipped and I fell on my back. I lost consciousness owing to the violence of the blow, and when I came to my senses again, about half an hour, I found myself in a very unpleasant situation. One of these monstrous animals had turned me upon my face, and had just seized my lead horn between his teeth in order to carry me off. Lo, heaven only knows where the beam would have dragged me, had I not pulled out my hunting knife. This very one you see here seized his left hind paw, and off 3 of the toes. He at once relaxed his grip and roared most horribly. I hastily picked up my rifle, which was lying a couple of paces off, and shot through the heart. The sound of the shot roused several thousand of these white bears who had been sleeping on the ice about half a mile away. Then all came at frill in my direction, and I set my wits to work, for I knew I was lost unless I could hit on a means of escape. In the same time as is taken by an expert hunter to skin a rabbit, I stripped off Master Bruin's coat and enveloped myself in it, placing my head immediately under his. The whole herd gathered round me directly, and I grew hot and cold fright. However, my disguise turned out admirably, for the bears evidently took me for one of themselves, and even invited me to join in their games. I imitated their gestures and movements as well as I could, planning meantime how to escape from their unwelcome society. Suddenly I remembered hearing an old army surgeon say that a wound in the spine was instant death. I determined to try the experiment and, taking up my knife again, I stmck the largest bear in the neck near the shoulders. I am sure you must think that was a very rash thing to do, and you are quite right, for had the creature survived my blow I should without the slightest doubt have been torn to pieces. But the stroke was a fatal one, and the bear fell dead at my feet without a groan. I resolved to kill all the others in the same manner, and this I easily accomplished, for although the bears saw their companions fall they had no idea there was anything wrong. And the whole herd lay dead before me. One felt myself a second Samson, having slain my thousands. To cut my story short, I went back to the ship and summoned the greater part of the crew to assist me in skinning the irars and carrying the pelts and hams on. We finished this business by sunset, and the captain's only regret was that his share in the Clag's doings had iron so small. My next sea voyage was made with Captain Hamilton to the East Indies, and I took with me a valuable pointer, whose scent was most extraordinarily keen. One day, when by our calculations we were at least 300 miles from land, my dog in great astonishment I mentioned this fact to the captain and officers, asserting that we must be near land, for my dog smelt game. This occasioned general laughter, but my confidence in my dog was undiminished, and I therefore offered to wager the captain 100 guineas that we should find game within half an hour. The captain, a rare good fellow, laughed heartily, and whispered to the ship's surgeon, "Munchausen is out of his senses. I cannot accept such a wager." The doctor replied in an audible whisper, "Indeed, Captain, he is as sane as you or I, but he puts greater confidence in his dog's scent than in the opinion of all the officers on Inard. He will certainly lose, but he richly deserves to do so. But I scarcely think the wager would be on my side, objected the captain. However, I could always redeem him the money a Fiendvarts. My dogs in the meantime had confirmed me still more in my opinion, and when I proposed the wager for the second time Hamilton accepted it. We had scarcely shaken hands on the wager, when some of the sailors, who had fishing in the stern, drew an exceedingly large shark out of the water. My dog very excited, and I merely remarked, "Here is the game." And sure enough, when the shark was cut open we found no less than 6 brace of live partridges inside it. They had been so long in that situation, that one of the hens was sitting on 17 eggs, one of which was just hatching when the shark was opened. This young one we brought up with a litter of young kittens, and the old cat became as fond of it as of any of her own young. During the whole voyage we were plentifully supplied with fresh eggs and young tender partridges. I won my wager, and my trusty dog was supplied with bones for dinner every day. Chapter 13 The Baron does the Shah a great service, and is rewarded Wt plus or minus a magnificent horse. Today, my friends and comrades, I will tell you what was perhaps the greatest service I have ever performed for anyone in my life. I have never spoken of this before, although it is recorded in detail in the astronomical records of Persum. After the adventures at sea, which I related to you yesterday, I resolved to visit the Shah of Persia. Several adventurous spirits joined me, and at their head I was enabled to perform various important services for the Shah. As we marched towards his capital on the frontier we were stopped by a Persian patrol and questioned concerning our intentions. I had scarcely mentioned my name and rank and said that it was our intention to visit His Highness, the Shah, when all the Persians bared their heads, and in the Persian language gave humble greeting to His Excellency, the Lord Baron of Munchausen. 2 days later we entered Tehran, where we heard to our great regret that the Shah and all his court had left 3 days previously for Shiraz. We received everywhere a royal welcome, and so many joined our troop that I entered Shiraz in a week's time at the head of nearly 100,000 men. From day to day the Shah received official tidings of our march from the mayors and other officials of every town on our route, and also read all the details of our journey in the Persian Mercury. When we approached Shiraz he came to meet me at the head of a long train of officials, and when he was close to us, he dismounted from his horse and embraced me. Afterwards he decorated me with the Persian Order of the Sun, and one that was made especially for me a representation in fine gold of the Rose of Shiraz. These were, he said, a slight acknowledgement for the services which I had rendered as ambassador to his dear friend and ally, the Sultan of Turkey. As a other mark of favour, the Shah bade me address him as brother, a mark of condescension never before vouchsafed to, and I made the condition that this familiar name should be kept for our private interviews, and that in public I might be allowed to address him as, Your Highness or Most Mighty Emperor of the Earth. Some weeks after our arrival in Shiraz, I was fortunate enough to hail the opportunity of performing a special service for His Majesty, the Shah. You must know that the Shah has a passion for the moon, which almost amounted to idolatry. One evening when the hill moon was shining brightly overhead, he and I were walking up and down a leafy avenue fragrant with roses, and the Shah was chanting one of the lovely songs of the late poet, Hafiz, when he suddenly broke off in the middle and, seizing my arm, cried out in a voice, "Look at the moon, it is covered with spots offmst." No, I replied, soothingly, those are not spots offmst. In our country we call this phenomenon an eclipse of the moon, and it takes place when, the moon being at its frill, the shadow of the earth filling on the bright disk, causes. My dear brother, he interrupted me, you are a fool, although a learned one. They are specks of rust resulting from damp weather. Ask the court astronomer, and you will see that I am right. It was the use of me asking, but the whole night long I lay awake, wondering how I could dissipate this dark superstition by the light of knowledge. At last I thought, all well, other countries, other manners. If such is the belief in this country, I must acquiesce in it. I left the palace before daybreak and went to for our ship's carpenter, who had accompanied me to Shiraz. We busied ourselves for some hours in drawing plans for machinery to lower the moon, in order to remove the supposed specks of rust. At the usual hour I sought an audience His Majesty, and humbly announced that in a few days I should be prepared to lower the moon and remove the lust. Munchausen, cried the Shah in ecstasy, if you can accomplish this, by the beard of the Prophet, I will make you the highest in rank of all the nobility in the country. On the same day we collected 3 companies, each consisting of 100 to pound sand, and an equal number of sand sifters. These 600 men had nothing to do but prepare sand to clean and polish the moon. The erection of the machinery we had designed was at once begun and, exactly a fortnight after the eclipse of the moon, the first trial was made with complete success. The civilized world consoled itself the earlier that the moon was invisible for a few days previous to the appearance of the so-called new moon. We, in Shiraz, had brought down the old fellow from the sky, found a large number of flecks of lust on its surface, and polished it till it was as bright and shining as before. This operation now takes place in Persia regularly once a month. I hope you gentlemen will remind me one day to show you my Persian orders and the magnificent white charger, which the Shah insisted on my accepting as a parting gift. I rode this noble animal for 20 years, and even after his so loath was I to part with him that I had him stuffed. This horse was so exceptionally swift, that when I first returned home and had to pay visits to all my neighbors, he would carry me from 30 to 40 miles in an afternoon and gallop after hares between an estate and another. Once I was pursuing a hare which ran straight across the high road. A coach containing 2 ladies just then passed down the road between me and the hare. My horse immediately leapt through the coach, the windows of which were wide open, with such impetus that I scarcely had time to take off my hat and beg the ladies' forgiveness for the liberty I had taken. We were 50 yards off, I remember, a rather amusing encounter I had that time. I am sure you must all one of my former playmates, Fat Will Huber. I had not seen him for a great many years, and met him quite by chance as he was coming home from the corn market in the neighbouring Tua, where he often had to go since he had taken over his mill. He had dismounted from his wagon and was waddling slowly along in the twilight, when I came up behind him and said, "Good evening, Will." "Gracious Hemen," he exclaimed in amazement, "the deceased Lord of Munchausen." "Nonsense," I said, angrily, "I am no more dead than you are your own fither." "Indeed you are dead. 17 years ago I saw you lying on your and I was present at your. I remember all we youngsters receiving a cake covered with. You must have molded away long ago, Baron." "Wait a moment, Will. I will show you whether I have mouldered away or am still living." With these words I gave him such a on the ears that the sound re-echoed. He fell to the ground stunned, and I let him lie there, for, thought I, naught never comes to harm. Some days later I rode past the mill, and saw Fat Will sitting contentedly on a bench humming a song. "Well, Will," said I, "do you now that I am alive, or shall I dismount and refresh your memory again?" "Oh, no, no. I believe everything you say, everything," said he, fearing what might follow. "That is well, and I am satisfied. I have plenty of equally striking proof at the service of any who are insolent enough to doubt the truth of any of my statements." Chapter 14. The Baron's wonderful waistcoat. "He pays a visit to Mount Etna. Dear friends and comrades," began the Baron the next evening, as he entered the assembly somewhat late, "you must be kind enough to excuse my tardy appearance and also my receiving you in hunting costume. It is the fault of my waistcoat. As you see, it is made of leather, the hide of my Wonderall dog, Boaster, of whom I am sure you have often heard me talk. He was shot by a blundering sportsman who fired at him instead of a covey of partridges. I saw the mishap from a distance of 30 paces, and when in dismay I rushed to the spot, the poor creature's eyes were already closed in death. He was just able to raise a paw in greeting and give one bark. His spirit departed for the happy hunting grounds. It is true there was only a dog, but what a dog! Cell 7 all of you here knew him, therefore I need say nothing. Filther_. He was to me more than a mere dog. I have never since possessed or even known another like him. At first I intended to have him stuffed, but then I wished to have him nearer me than that, so I had a waistcoat made from his skin, that I might always carry part of him next my heart when I went hunting. A very strange thing happened with regard to this. The first time I wore this waistcoat, just as I was crossing a clover field in which there might be some partridges, I felt something tugging in the region of my heart. This oppression increased with every step till at last I was forced to stand still in order to draw breath. At last it became so unbearable that I could not at all, when suddenly one of the buttons flew off my waistcoat and landed about 15 paces away to the left. About a dozen partridges flew up, I fired, and 5 of them fell at once to the ground. Picking them up and putting them in my game bag, I walked on. In a few minutes the feeling of oppression and the subsequent springing off of a button were repeated, and this happens every time I am near any game. The starting of every partridge, quail, or hare costs me a button, but this button always procures me a certain shot. You can see that there used to be 2 rows of 11 buttons each on my waistcoat, and that now only 3 are left. Next week I shall have the buttons renewed for the 9th time. Do you think of this proof of my dog's fidelity even after death? It is true that I am an old man now, but the recollection of my faithful dog always makes me sad. Come, fill up your glasses, comrades, and I will tell you another of me adventures, which just occurred to me as I was walking along. Some years ago I was on a visit to Sicily at a time when Mount Etna had begun to erupt and was casting up flames and ashes daily. At Catania I joined a party of English ladies and gentlemen and rode with them to the Casa Inglese, English house, where we spent the night. In the morning the mule drivers and guides advised us to turn back, because the eruption of stones and lava had increased. The whole party, the exception of myself, followed this advice, but I continued the ascent with a light heart, and reached the summit in about 3 hours' time. I walked 3 times round the edge of the crater, which looks like an enormous flannel. The view over sea and land is magnificent, but I was far more interested in investigating the interior of the mountain, and at last I made up my mind to jump down into the abyss. I found myself in a warm and my body bruised and burnt by the hot cinders, which were continually flying round me, but to draw back now was impossible. Glowing cinders and stones rushed upwards, as I sank downwards ever-increasing speed. Perhaps I used to the heat and fell asleep. At any rate I lost consciousness for some time. At last I reached the ground, and the shock of the fall and the noisy clamour round me soon restored me to my senses. Opening my eyes, I found to any great astonishment that I was in the presence of Vulcan and his Cyclops. It is true then, though no one belies it, that Vulcan has his forge in the interior of Mount Etna. One needs to travel to find out all kinds of curious things. You Carl imagine the astonishment of Father Vulcan and his sooty companions at my sudden appearance. When I had introduced myself with proper ceremony, Vulcan limped to a cupboard and out plaster and ointment, which he applied to my wounds with his own hankel. His remedies were indeed wonderful, for not only did they heal me completely in a moment, but also restored all the burnt places in my clothing. A young Cyclops brought me a basin of warm sea water to complete my toilet, and then my host led me into the presence of his consort Venus, who was a wonderfully preserved woman considering her age of some thousands of years. There are 2 things I have keenly regretted ever since. First, that I did not ask from which firm I could obtain the underall ointment or the recipe from which Vulcan prepared it, and secondly, that I omitted to find out what means Venus used to preserve her beauty. I hail some aunts who would be very grateful for the information, though they are by no means as old as Venus. Both Vulcan and his wife treated me with the greatest kindness, though the lady never conversed me, a mocking smile and a certain look of compassion on her lovely face, as if she were always thinking, "I am really sorry for you, poor earthworm." I must admit that I was often annoyed by the gracious condescension of a heathen goddess. As for Vulcan, he was the embodiment of kindness and affability, conducting me in person over his subterranean kingdom. He showed me the different workshops where the Cyclops forged various implements for ordinary use. In one were joiners or cabinet makers, another plows and other agricultural implements, and other contained files and saws, or all kinds of instruments of war. I also noticed various passages branching right and left, all closed by heavy iron doors on which was written in flaming letters, "To Mount Vesuvius," or, "To Mount Hecla," or the name of some other active or extinct volcano. On one of these doors was the word Stromboli, and under it in 48 different languages, "No admittance." "Where does that lead to?" I asked. "Where does that lead to?" I asked. "Oh," replied Vulcan, indifferently, as he walked on, "that is a little workshop in which many things are made that people are not allowed to see, and therefore we grant no admittance." Then he muttered something to himself which I could not quite hear, but I fancied I caught the words, "man traps and spring guns." The same afternoon I asked Venus, in the course of conversation, whether she had often been inside Stromboli. "Newer," she replied, "the entrance is forbidden. I only know that my husband does his private work there, including among other things the thunderbolts for Father Zeus." I skillfully turned the conversation to other subjects, but determined to find out the secret of this workshop at the earliest opportunity. The next day Vulcan I was called away for a short time to settle a dispute among the work people, and I crept softly to the forbidden door. Although it was not, I hesitated for some time to open it. At last I did so, and was just al-Qayyud to close it behind me, when a fearful one clasp of thunder rolled forth, and in 48 different languages the warning flamed out on the wall, "Man traps and spring guns." I stopped a moment, undecided whether, in spite of warning, I should not walk down the magically illuminated passage, when suddenly a rough hand seized me by the collar and, though I hardly liked confessing it, I was soundly by the Cyclops. At last, if the words hold, enough, Vulcan rescued me from the claws of his dependents, but only to drag me to a dark passage, and holding me at arm's length over a gloomy L, cast me to it, saying angrily, "Ungrate one mana, as a punishment for your prying curiosity, return to the world of misery from whence you came." I fell and fell with ever-increasing rapidity, till the H01 tour of my mind deprived me of all reflection. Suddenly I was aroused by falling into a large body of water illumined by the rays of the setting sun. I soon reached the surface and had to rely on my swimming capacities for escape. But in which direction should I swim? Any other in my place would have despaired, but I only gazed calmly round me, nothing but sky and sea, the latter unpleasantly cold after the mild temperature of Vulcan's shop. At last I perceived a huge iceberg about miles away. I swam up to it, and, my limbs being stiff with cold, climbed with great difficulty to the summit. On the other side of the iceberg I saw a canoe containing 5 savages and one all busily engaged in catching seals. I hailed these men as loudly as I could, and then, having attracted their notice, slid rapidly down the smooth and slippery side of the iceberg into the sea close to the canoe. I was helped on, and, in answer to my question, the Dutchman told me that he was the sole survivor of a crew, which had been wrecked on a hitherto undiscovered island in the Pacific. All the others had been drowned. Everything now became quite clear to me. What I had taken for a well must have been a shaft through the center of the earth, and I had passed from Mount Etna straight into the South Seas. My only regret was that I had noticed so little on the journey. If any one of you should imitate my leap into Mount Etna, I sincerely trust that you will be far more particular in your observations than it was possible for me to. Chapter 15. The undiscovered island of Te Haitlabiati. The Baron's arrival and escape from it. The Dutchman, whose name was Jan van Vessel, steered towards the undiscovered island and told me on the way that it was called Te Haitlabiati by the natives and was governed by a very good-natured prince, who had a special liking for roast foreigners after they had been fattened for some months on fruit. He himself had been fed up, but shortly before he was fit for eating there had a shower of meat pies, some of which he had eaten, and the prince in great annoyance had given orders that, in a month's time, he should be fit and again, and then roasted immediately. "Nay, Jan," said I, somewhat incredulously, "you can tell that tale of the shower of meat pies to anyone else, but not to me. I am the renowned Baron von Munchausen, and have travelled over the whole world, but nowhere does it rain pastry." "Indeed, your Excellency," asserted the honest Dutchman, "this kind of rain often occurs in the island of Te Haitlabiati. On the mountains of the island are found a number of bread trees of a peculiar kind, bearing a small fruit, which looks and tastes exactly like a meat patty. When half ripe, these fruits are blown off by the wind and strewn like hailstones over the plain. Later on I convinced myself of the existence of these trees, which are quite unknown to intanists of the civilized world. During the foregoing conversation we had reached the island on whose shore sat the prince to ivy whom the Dutchman introduced me by all my titles. The prince bowed graciously, and then whispered to his prime minister, "Let him be fattened at once." A truly inviting prospect for me. One very remarkable circumstance was that, although my reputation had not penetrated to the island on account of its not yet being discovered, the plant world knew my celebrity well, for as we walked towards the prince's palace, which turned out after all to be only a mud hut, all the trees enwed respectfully me, as if they wished to give fitting greeting to His Excellency von Munchausen. This circumstance impressed the prince so much, that he whispered to his prime minister, "You need not hurry Munchausen's fitting." When the Dutchman interpreted these words a weight fell from my heart, which I will show you one day in my cabinet of curiosities. It is striped red, white and blue like the Dutch flag, and, although I have had it cut down, it still weighs about 32 pounds. I carried this stone home with me as a curiosity, although my way of travelling rendered it rather difficult to transport. At a few hundred paces distance from the prince's palace there stood a group of 12 large trees, covered with fruit the size of a child's head. On the 3 tallest of these trees were 3 men head downwards, and you can imagine how strange it looked when these trees also bowed to me. I inquired what crime these men had committed to deserve so severe a punishment. With the assistance of the friendly Dutchman I found out that these 3 men had been to foreign lands, and on their return had deceived everybody by describing places they had never seen, and relating things which not only had never happened, but were quite beyond the of possibility. After hearing this, I considered the horrible punishment well deserved, for nothing is more detestable than a traveller who does not adhere strictly to the truth in his stories. I cannot give you any other information than native customs, as my stay in the island was embittered by the prospect of being fattened on fruit and serred up as a roast joint. In order to avoid, if possible, this fate, I sought a private interview with Jan van Vessel the evening of the self-same day. He was enchanted with my proposal that we should escape from the island together, but seemed very dejected to Thurlk that we did not know at all where Te Haitlabiati was situated, seeing that it has never really been discovered. "We shall never be able to find our way back to Europe again," was his concluding remark. However, I reassured him on that score, by that it did not matter in the least which direction we took as long as we avoided a southerly one, and that all we had to do was to find some civilized people who could show us the right way. We then discussed the possibility of building and equipping a boat in secret, and when I asked the various kinds of natives and more especially concerning the trees on which the natives were hanging, which I imagined from their appearance must a kind of tulip tree. "I do not know if they belong to that species," answered Jan, "but as I have seen, the fruit is a kind of gourd or rather hollow bladders like little balloons." The fruit is always plucked half ripe, as otherwise the sunshine expands the air and the bladders so much, that these trees are torn out of the earth by there and carried far away by the wind. All at once I was seized one of my brilliant ideas and cried out joyfully as I embraced him, "Fellow countryman, we are sard. When is this fruit plucked?" "In a few days' time, I expect." "And what is done with the gourds?" "I have told that a few dozen are always tied together and laid in the sun, the heat causes them to swell and light, and then they fly away into the air. The day on which this takes place is kept as a feast day here, and is called the Flight of the Gourds." I knew enough now for my purpose, and began making experiments, while Jan laid in a supply of provisions. We divided the food between us, filled our pockets, and when in the course of a few days the little bladders, in bundles of a dozen each, were placed in the sun to dry, I secretly fastened 8 or 10 bundles to my girdle. Jan did the same, and the balloons expanded so quickly that we were raised in the air almost at the same moment, and carried far out to sea by a boisterous west wind. Here we were separated, but I saw from afar that Jan sank deeper and deeper, and at last fell into the sea, but was at once fished out by the crew of a passing ship. I learned afterwards that he reached home safely, and was appointed taxidermist to the Natural History Museum in Amsterdam or Leiden, where he remains to this day, and can easily be asked to confirm the truth of my story. I myself underwent some anxious moments, for I could not make up my mind whether to cut off a few dozen bladders and also let myself drop into the sea or not. It seemed very doubtful if I could overtake the ship, which was scudding along the wind with all sails set, and my chance of doing so diminished every second. Suddenly I was caught up by one of those terrible cyclones, which prevail in that sea, and whirled for 3 days and 3 nights with such violence that I was glad to have my heavy stone as ballast, and that the provisions I carried secured me from the risk of starvation. At last, becoming dizzy, I lost consciousness and fell into the Seine. The cold water restored me to my senses, and I saved myself by the marvelous swimming feat of overtaking a ship, which was sailing about 17 miles ahead. This vessel proved to be a Turkish man of war, and, once on board, I thought that all my troubles were at an end. But the same evening as we sat over a glass of sailor's grog, which was so stiff that we could not drink it, but had to cut it up with our knives and eat it spoons, and I began to relate my adventures on the undiscovered seven-aired island and the effects oft whirlwind, some of my listeners pulled wry faces as if they doubted the truth of my story, although I told it as simply and straightforwardly as I have to you. The captain was even thoughtless enough to whisper to his neighbor, "I don't believe such a storm ever took place." Well, he was only a poor heathen, and punishment quickly followed on his rash words. When we crept into our bunks, the wind was blowing from the south, and the heavens were bright and cloudless, but we had scarcely fallen asleep, when we were awakened by a most unpleasant tossing of the ship, which reeled like a drunken man, first to the right, and then to the left. This was caused by a violent wind blowing alternately 3 minutes from the west, and then the same length of time from the east, a phenomenon I had never experienced before, and which is extremely unpleasant. At last, at break of day, the wind leered round to the non and blew very stormily. All at once a H01 terrible crash was heard, and the mainmast, which had loosened during the night, fell smashing the whole compass to atoms as it did so. Now a voyage without compass is like blindfolding a traveller by land, and placing him before 4 crossroads without a signpost. It was as for us to try and find our way as it would have been for him. The storm raged for a whole month. In the daytime a dim twilight prevailed, and then our nights were black as pitch. We saw neither sun, moon, nor stars, for 13 weeks. We could gauge the violence of storm by seeing the masts snapped off one after another, and for weeks at a time our rudderless wreck was hurled from the crest of one wave straight through the air onto the crest of another, which was very remarkable considering that this ship with its 70 cannon and crew of about 500 men, even without its masts and tackle, weighed some thousands oftens. At last the wind subsided, but the sea was still in such an uproar that, even after the cessation of the storm, the waves continued mountain high, and Kaltide our wrecked vessel slowly in one particular direction. "Whither are we drifting?" asked all in intense anxiety, and, indeed, it was high time that we reached land in order to take in fresh supplies, for our provisions had very low. Just as the last rations were being divided, the sky cleared and a light breeze sprang up laden with a peculiar aroma. We all sniffed at this strange perfume, which resembled that of oranges, but yet was something quite different. Suddenly an idea began to dawn on me, but not quite sure. I merely remarked, "It smells like roast beef and Havana cigars." "Yes, yes," exclaimed an hundred laces, "that's just what it is." We lived for a whole week on this nourishing air, while we drifted slowly along. On the 8th day we came in sight of land, and, to our great astonishment, this turned out to be the town of Havana, which is situated at the extreme north of the island of Cuba, hence the perfume of tobacco. The same evening, as I sat smoking a costly Havana cigar, I began to relate to the tobacco planters some of my various adventures, more especially those I had experienced lately. To my great annoyance, loud shouts of laughter arose among my audience, and some stood on their heads, others tumbled somersaults, and others again smoothed their hair, saying mockingly, "These tales really make one's hair stand on end." Naturally, I left the assembly in other m.org, and shipped the same evening for Europe, unable to endure any longer the company of men who could not distinguish between lying brag and the simple tmth. With this, gentlemen, I will close my narrative for today, thanking you all for the kind attention with which you have hitherto followed the recital of my adventures. Chapter 16 Renla Remarkable degrees of cold. A trustworthy friend once told me that when he was sailing in the Arctic regions the cold was so intense that if anyone brought a lighted wax or tallow candle on deck it froze immediately, flame and all. I have never actually seen this myself, and should be inclined to discredit the story had I not experienced cold equally intense in Russum. It is easy enough to shake one's head unbelievingly. Something or other seems impossible, but as the proverb says, live and learn. One very severe winter in Russia I was out hunting for bears. The cold was so bitter that at every shot I fired the flint of my gun flew into several pieces. I had just shot a gigantic she-bear when the same thing happened, and before I had time to take a fresh flint stone out of I heard a terrible roar close to me, and, turning my head in the direction of the noise, the mate of the dead bear making towards me with its forepaws outstretched and wide open jaws. As I had no desire to be embraced by the newly made widower, and my gun was for the moment useless, I climbed hastily up the nearest tree in order to be prepared to again. In a few moments I had reached a high branch, and sitting down comfortably on it, I soon loaded my gun. I then hastily set about screwing in a fresh flint, when suddenly the screwdriver fell from my benumbed hands to the ground. There I sat defenseless, expecting every moment that Bruin would climb the tree after me. Fortunately his attention was attracted first by his murdered companion, and he walked straight up to her to find out why she was lying in a pool of blood on the snow. He pushed the stiffened corpse with his muzzle, sniffed at it several times, and then felt it with his claws. Finding this of no avail, he turned the body over and tried to make it stand upright. All, of course, in vain. This took some little time, and I employed it to repossess myself of my screwdriver. I could not descend from the tree to regain it, but the freezing cold was my help. In my pocket I had a piece of bread, left over from my early breakfast. This I chewed up, pushed the end of my dog leash through it, and let down the piece of bread, which clung firmly round the leash, onto the spot where the screwdriver was lying. In a second they froze together, and I hurriedly drew up the line with the bread, my screwdriver and a lump of ice, all sticking to the end of it. You can easily guess what followed. I put a new flint into my gun, and sent a shot through the bear's hilt, which forthwith stretched him lifeless on the ground beside his mate. I was unfeignedly glad at the lucky ending of this adventure, for you can imagine that I was almost in despair, as I sat on the branch listening to the Eikermunk is dead, and vowing deadly vengeance against me. Chapter 17. A story told by Baron's nephew. At the next meeting of his boon companions, the Baron came in with a young man, whom he introduced to the company as his nephew, Walter. This nephew, he said, was staying with him for a few days, and he particularly wished to present him to his friends, as several of them had known the young man's twin brother, Albert, at the university. "Come, Albert," cried a young lawyer, "why do you allow your uncle to pass you off as your brother, Walter, whom I hail never seen, whereas you and I were at college together?" "Because this youth really is Walter," answered the Baron for him, "although he is as ilka his twin brother as two peas." The lawyer left his seat and approached the pair, but maintained stoutly on close inspection that the young man was his friend and former fellow student, Albert, whom he knew intimately. "No indeed, my dear fellow, on my word of honor as a soldier, this is not your friend Alban but his brother, Walter." However, since the intimate friend of the one brother still persists in declaring that Alban, whom he has never seen, is his former fellow student, I will ask my nephew to relate how he and his twin brother have been constantly mistaken one another all their. "Yes, gentlemen," said Walter, "from our earliest youth we have been taken for one another, because we were so much alike that even our parents could not distinguish between us. We were always dressed in different colored clothes from babyhood, and as blue was the tint chosen for me, I was called Boy Blue, and who has always been devoted to forestry, wore green frocks, and received the nickname of Boy Green. As we grew older we dressed alike, and I will tell you one of the numerous jests we were enabled to play owing to our great similarity. Last autumn we went on a walking tour through the Harz district, and after a week's journey we spent the night at a little village called Wernig. The next morning, when the barber we had ordered Karn into the house, I was still in my bedchamber, while Albert was waiting for him in the dressing room. My brother sat down to be shaved, and, when the barber had made his face quite smooth, he came into the bedroom a moment to wash off the lather. I seized the opportunity to enter in my shin sleeves, and seat myself in my brother's empty chair with the remark, "Now, my good man, do shave me properly, I cannot go about all Sunday with a beard half an inch long." The barber shook his head, and, coining nearer, said, "Ivhy, sir, I shaved you well just a moment ago," but he got no _. Pale with fear and astonishment, he prepared the lather again and soaped my face vigorously. As he shaved me he murmured, "I ha seen a beard grow so quickly in my life. It almost makes one believe in witchcraft. Whatever will my wife say when I tell her such a wonderful thing as this?" When he had finished I asked him the amount of his fee, but when I pressed double the amount into his hand, the honest fellow wished to return me half of it. Naturally, I refused to take it, for he had well earned his money. Still ill of astonishment the barber took his departure, and as he went out I heard him say, "That's stranger than any story I've ever heard told." The audience laughed heartily at the tale, but the Baron said a contemptuous smile, as he stroked his smooth chin, "I do not consider the hoax anything very wonderful, Walter, since, after all, it only rests on the wonderful resemblance between you, and you were two people. I once threw a barber into much greater confidence unaided, and I will relate to you how it came about. One of my friends, who emigrated to America, discovered there a marvelous pomade for promoting the growth of the hair, and some years ago he sent me a present of large boxes of preparation. As I have never wom a beard, and therefore had no need of it, I sent the boxes up into and my clever John put them on the window ledge, just where they would catch the strongest rays oft noonday. Some I did not trouble the stuff a long time, thinking it was sure to be some American fraud, but one day, happening to enter the room where it was kept, I found the floor covered almost knee-deep with frothy liquid. The heat of the sun had melted all the fat in the boxes, and it had ran out. But the strength had been retained in what I was left, and naturally had greatly increased and concentrated. I immediately tested it by dipping my forefinger into a pot and smearing my upper lip. I felt a slight pricking sensation, but nothing more. The next morning I hardly recognized myself when I perceived the bushy dragoon's mustache, which had grown overnight. A few days later I greatly perplexed the barber at Bodenberg by a trick I played on him. This man used to shave me nearly every day, and one morning when he had just finished I went out into the next room and nabbed a little of the pomade on my face. After a minute I came back with a fresh already sprouting, and angrily showed the barber, who had already packed up all his things, the result of his work. In great astonishment he commenced shaving me over again. I repeated this trick 17 times the same morning, till the barber was almost too exhausted to move his arms, and his razors were quite blunt. I am sorry I cannot show you how it was done, as I have not the smallest remnant of the magic pomade left. I used it all on a white pony which I bought in Holland, and it produced such a fme crop of hair that he looked like a curly poodle, and created universal astonishment when he came run me after me with his long hair streaming in the Toby. I was not pleased with the rapid results of the pomade, for long locks grew from the palms of his hands, and on his right cheek, which he had accidentally touched while rubbing the pony. However, he profited considerably by exhibiting himself for money in various towns. Perhaps some of you may remember seeing him, although it is a good many years ago since the affair happened. Chapter 18 The Baron's voyage in a balloon. When I was in the service of the Turks, I frequently used to row myself about in a pleasure inn on the Sea of Marmora. One morning, when I was admiring the cloudless sky, I observed a dark speck in the air, which no resemblance to a bird. Fortunately, I had my fowling piece with me, without which I never move if I can help it. I fired 3 or 4 times at the dark speck, but it was beyond the range of my bullets, or else I should certainly have hit it, for I am an unerring shot. I then loaded my gun with 5 times the amount of powder and 3 bullets, in order to shoot farther. I swayed to and fro, but such a trifle makes no difference to a good shot. I fired my overloaded gun, and the recoil was so violent that I fell senseless to the bottom of my inn When I reopened my eyes, the mysterious object was rapidly descending, and I perceived it was not a bird, but a balloon. I was now able to judge at what an immense height it must have been, for the balloon was as large round as the cupola of the great mosque of Constantinople, and from it was suspended a car larger than my boat. This huge object came nearer and finally fell with a splash, which was heard all over Constantinople, into the Ivater close to my boat. The noise was like the explosion of a powder magazine, and I was only thankful that the monstrous thing had fallen a little distance from my boat and not right on top of it. When the wash of the Ivater had somewhat subsided, I rowed nearer and found, seated in the car, a starved-looking Englishman, named Mr. Smith, who hailed me with exaggerated as his deliverer. The poor fellow was an aeronaut by profession, and 5 days previously had left New York with 2 assistants, intending to cross the Falls of Niagara, but as they approached the falls they were met by a strong west wind, which carried them towards the Atlantic. The travelers tried to open the valve, in order to let out the air and descend, but the connecting cord was broken, and they were unable to do so before they had left the mainland of America behind them. Mr. Smith then advised his THW men to let themselves down by a strong parachute, which they had them, before they were carried right out to sea. This advice was followed, and the descent safely accomplished on the coast of Newfoundland, while the aeronaut himself rehearsed to abandon his air ship, and drifted out to sea, trusting that the wind would carry him as Europe. But the balloon had been driven hither and thither by contrary winds, and even when the starving traveller, whose provisions had long been exhausted, saw land once more beneath him, he was powerless to dissemble had not my bullets made a rent in the silk, causing the air to msh out and the car to sink. The poor man must inevitably have perished of hunger and exhaustion. Out of gratitude he wished to make me a present of the balloon, but I refused the gift as I could make no use of it. Seeing, however, that he was anxious to make me some return for saving his life, I consented to accompany him on a short trip, which he assured me I should find very pleasant. My new friend at once set about repairing the hole in the balloon, and on the following day announced that he was prepared to start. He stepped into the car, accompanied by a large Persian dog, which he had purchased on account of its rarity. Then, cutting the rope by which the airship was to a rock, we shot upwards with the speed of an arrow. At first the movement was too quick for me, but I soon became accustomed to it, and was delighted at the magnificent vista of land and sea, which opened out our eyes. We mounted higher and higher, and in an hour the whole lay spread beneath us like a map, still higher, and we were gazing across Asia as far as China and Japan. It was most interesting and instructive, and I forgot all else as I drank in the enchanting view. At last I was struck by the anxious expression on my guide's face, and he confessed, for the heat was increasing every moment, that he had never before ascended so high, and in his haste he had probably filled the balloon with too much gas. The heat intense, and the balloon swelled and crackled ominously, but we still continued to rise. "We are several miles high now," whispered my friend, "but I do not think we shall come to any harm unless a seam gives way." "Are we really several miles high?" I asked. "Doubtful_ally_. Indeed we are," replied the aeronaut. "I estimate that we are from 15 to 20 miles the sea, because the enormous heat shows that we have approached much nearer the sun, and the earth looks like a flat plain, without hills or valleys." I advised him to open the valve, so that some of the gas might escape and enable us to descend, but he said that he had already pulled the cord which was attached to the valve several times, and that it must have stuck fast. At that moment, the dog, which had hitherto lain quietly in the bottom of the car, stood up and began to howl most piteously. Gradually his cries grew weaker, and at last died away altogether, because the air became so thin that even we men could hardly manage to speak. Try how we we continued to rise, and at last we could only manage to communicate one another by signs. Trusting to my greater strength, I took the valve cord from my companion's hand and pulled it with all my tmght. The valve did not open, but the thick cord snapped right across. I fell to the of the car still clutching the piece of cord, and when I was able to stand up again and look round, I discovered that the Englishman lay unconscious, and the dog was dead. The heat was unbearable and my thirst was intense, but my first thought was to help my poor friend. I looked around in despair, but we had drunk all our a long time before, and cast the intels overboard. My gaze fell on the dog, and I at once set to work to skin it. This done, I forced my friend to swallow a little of the blood, and I did likewise, which strengthened us considerably. Our lives were sailed easy, but our ascent must cease at any cost, for we were now close to the sun, and the heat was past endurance. Resolutely I seized my gun and fired into the balloon till the air was too thin for any report to be heard, but the shot had penetrated the bladder and made several small holes through which the air slowly escaped, and the balloon began to sink. The air soon grew colder, and we felt ravenously hungry. To the bet of my had never tasted dog's flesh before, but I was so hungry that I had almost resolved to eat some raw. To our great joy we found the dog completely roasted, and I can assure you that I have tasted much worse meat. The shade of the balloon had protected us to some extent. The dog had been lying exposed to the sun and had gradually roasted in its own fat. During our meal we rapidly descended to earth, and soon landed on a date palm, so that our descent was easily provided. After consuming several pounds of dates, we climbed down the tree and found close at hand a spring of fresh water, in which we were glad to bathe our blistered limbs. Wearied our exertions oft day, we then stretched ourselves on the mossy edge off spring, and were soon asleep. The next moment we were roused by the approach of a caravan of Arabian merchants. Uho told us that we had landed on an oasis in Arabia, which lay on the direct route to Jerusalem. Thither they were journeying, and would be glad of our company and protection. We gladly consented, and on the way, with the assistance of one of the merchants, I made myself an excellent pair of out of the dog's skin, and have worn them constantly for the last 11 years. Chapter 19. Fish Story. The Baron's adventures with a huge cannon. And honored friends and comrades, said the Baron at the next meeting, I am alone agam today, as my nephew has destined me. His brother has sent an urgent message for him to return, and my wife has gone with him. I therefore invite all you gentlemen to dine with me tonight at the inn at my expense. I am celebrating today the silver wedding of a very old friend of mine, and I trust you will not only favor me with your company, but allow me also to present to you a new acquaintance. But before we dine, permit me to finish the story of me pleasure trip, the effects of which I suffered from for some time afterwards. Hen we reached Jerusalem, near. Smith took ship direct for London, and I returned to Constantinople. The Sultan was greatly distressed at my mysterious disappearance, and had sent criers through all the principal streets of the town, to announce that he would give 1,000 gold pieces to anyone who could either produce or bring news of the lost Baron. These tidings reached me on my journey, and, directly I in Constantinople, I sent a messenger to the royal to announce the arrival of a gentleman who brought news of the lost Baron. His Majesty at once appeared, bringing with him a purse containing the 1,000 gold pieces. You can judge by this how much His Majesty valued me. My dear Munchausen, he exclaimed, with rapture, how delighted I am to see you once more. You here have you hiding close to the sun, said L. Strolling through the park together. I recounted to the astonished Sultan all the details of my adventure, and bemoaned my exhaustion and loss of strength. We were standing by the celebrated brass cannon, probably the largest in the world, which carried a marble ball of 1,100 pounds weight, and requires 330 pounds weight of powder. I suppose you could not lift that cannon, said the Sultan, smiling. I have no objection to trying, I replied, lifting the brazen monster with one hand. Oh well, that's easy enough, said the Sultan, but I will wager you that you cannot carry it 100 paces. I hesitated a moment, but my pride was roused, and, throwing off my coat and waistcoat, I seized the cannon in hands, balanced it on my left shoulder, and carried it the required distance. Then, still holding the cannon, I ran to the Ivadid's edge, plunged in, and swam out into the sea. Take heed what you are doing, cried the Sultan, you will not are able to hold out long. What I will your highness wager that I do not swim to the opposite shore? I cried. 60,000 double ducats was his answer. I made no reply, but merely swam on, and, using my utmost exertions, soon reached the coast of Asim. Somewhat wearied, I rested on the shore until the Sultan's chief minister arrived in an 18-oared galley, bringing the message that his master was delighted at my success, and offered me 4 times the amount if I'll restore the cannon to its former place. Much can be accomplished for such an enormous reward, and I felt imbued with fresh strength. Assuring the minister that the Sultan should hail my answer directly, I wrung my arm, seized the cannon, and threw it towards the European coast, but I had miscalculated my strength. Unfortunately, the heavy cannon slipped a little in my hand just as I was about to discharge it, and fell, together with my prospect of a substantial reward, into the sea, where it still lies to the present day. I dared not venture to show myself in Constantinople again, for a price had been set on my head. I therefore exchanged clothes with a poor labourer, and made my escape that very night on a vessel bound for Venice. Since this fiasco I have never ventured on Turkish soil again. But here comes our hostess with the new acquaintance I promised to introduce to you. Allow me to present to you a very delicate kind of salmon trout, which is only to be found in the Lake of Constance. Exactly 25 years ago I was staying at Basley in order to ir present at the wedding of one of my friends. The wedding feast was to be given at a large inn, and when I went there a week before the ceremony to make the formal arrangements, I found the landlady complaining bitterly that she was unable to obtain any off-teas salmon trout in time for the wedding day. I asked her to describe to me exactly what these were, and, although I am not particularly fond of fishing, I went to the Lake of Constance, and in 3 days had caught a whole barrel of these fish. But how could I return in time? I discovered to my H01 tour that I had made a mistake in the date, and that the wedding was to take place that very morning. I determined at all costs to back in time with my fish, so seating myself on the cask, I floated down the Rhine. On the way I caught 19 large salmon, which I harnessed to my cask of fish, and now we spun along so swiftly, that I reached Basley within 2 hours. The only danger I encountered was when passing the falls of when my improvised was nearly upset, but I escaped with a wetting, and earned the grateful thanks of the whole wedding party. Today, in celebration of his silver wedding, my friend has sent me a dozen salmon trout and a cask of wine. I call upon you all, my friends, to charge your glasses and drink to the long life of the happy pair, to the assembled company, and to the veracity of all tales of adventure. Thus the hours sped along, and when the Baron took leave of his guests, he announced that he was going away for some time, as he had promised to accompany his friends at Basley on a long tour through Switzerland. Chapter 20 An Adventure in Switzerland. Well, Munchausen, said the head forester, on the eve of the Baron's departure, have you ever been to Switzerland before? Dozens of times, replied the Baron. I know every inch of that glorious country. I will tell you a little incident which took place on my first visit there, but before beginning, as we shall not meet again for some time, I take the opportunity of thanking you all for the kind attention with which you have always listened to my simple narratives. A good many years ago, 11 of my friends and myself, accompanied by a guide named Basil Truman, climbed the Jungfrau, the ascent of which had before Iron attempted. We reached the summit with some difficulty, our guide being rather hampered in his movements by his little son, whom he had brought with him. It is a custom of the Swiss guides and chamois hunters to take their little ones up on the mountains as soon as they can walk at all, in order to accustom them to climbing from their earliest years. It is by no means uncommon to see children of 2 and 3 years old, with their tiny alpenstocks and snowshoes, accompanying strangers up the mountains. Though little Basil was 6 years old, this was his first climb, as he had been too sickly hitherto. It was unfortunate that the little fellow had had no practice, for after the first half-hour he could not keep pace with us. We decided to carry him in turns, and as there were 12 of us it could easily have been managed, only they all quarrelled as to who should ir the first. I made an end to the dispute by hoisting the little fellow on my shoulders, and on we went. This answered very well, and little Basil was delighted at this new way of climbing, but as we got higher the cold became intense, and at last the boy froze onto my shoulder, just as if he were growing there. The ascent was interesting, though very. We climbed for days and 2 nights, hewing steps in the smooth ice for the greater part of the way. At last we reached the summit and revelled in the enchanting view on every side. My little rider was so firmly frozen that he had to be cut from me with knives, and when we placed him on his feet, his legs were so numb that he swayed backwards and forwards on them. Then he lost his footing, and a loud cry of horror broke from 13 throats as he rolled with the speed of a falling stone down the steep declivity. Each time he turned over, a fresh layer of snow clung to his body, and at last we only saw an immense snowball rolling down the mountain side. With the aid of our field glasses we followed the gigantic lump of snow, till with a final leap it fell into a terrible abyss never trodden by man. We all stood petrified with horror, till Truman and I called out simultaneously, "After him!" Our companions tried to dissuade us from the daring feat of sliding down a distance of 13,000 feet, but we persisted in the attempt. We inand ourselves firmly together ropes, and staffed to descend. I will not inflict you with the here trending details. Suffice to say, sorely bruised but with limbs unbroken, we reached the inn an hour, and beheld the gigantic snowball with its human kernel fixed amid the branches of a withered tree. Fortunately Tmaman had his ice axe, and with infinite difficulty we succeeded in cutting down the tree. We then turned our attention to the snowball, and it frozen in as many layers as an omen. These layers we carry L11y removed one by one, though we despaired of finding the boy alive. At last, after some hours' toil, a cry was heard, and the child crept out of the snowy covering which had protected him during his terrible fall. The father's joy was indeed touching, and freely repaid me for my arduous exertions. Strange to relate, little Basil was quite unhurt, but when he emerged from the snow which had kept him warm, he froze quite stiff. We carried him home, and on the way had 1 or 2 narrow escapes from avalanches. The child had to stop in bed a fortnight before he was completely thawed. We fed him with hot goat's milk every 2 hours, and thus small-ed his life. In his delirium he called continually on his noble deliverer, as he termed me. It will be a great pleasure for me to see him again as a grown man, and press him to my heart. And now, my dear friends and comrades, till my return from the land of snow and glaciers, may heaven grant we all meet again. Chapter 21 Psalm of the Baron's adventures in America and the story of the bear that was taken for a general. A year later, Baron Munchausen walked unexpectedly into the room which had been the scene of so many of his narrative 1,7 es. He was greeted boisterously by the assembled company and overwhelmed with questions such as, where had he been, what adventures had he experienced, why had he stayed away so long, and countless others. Smiling, the Baron replied, "My dear friends and comrades, I find the only way to manage when one is so with questions is to pick out one and reply to that alone, otherwise there is no end to the talking. I will therefore only reply to the questioner who asked me where I have just come from. Do not surprised if I tell you from the land of the Indians, from America. All, that does surprise you, as I can see from your amazed expressions. Yes, gentlemen, I come from America, and I have traveled through every district in it during the last year, while my wife was paying a long visit to her aunt in Paris. America is indeed a marvelous country. I should like to have been there before it was discovered, and while it was still in its primitive state. But at the present day this country has reached such a high state of that a simple citizen of the old world can scarcely credit the marvels the sees every day there. I myself experienced a proof so miraculous as to be almost incredible. The cultivated part of the country is traversed by high roads, and on one side of them are laid 2 endless lines of iron rods, along which long rows of wagons are driven merely by the power of steam. These ironways were invented in 1650, and ever since the year 1767 their use has become almost universal in America. They are called railways, and will soon be introduced into Europe. The most wonderful thing about them is the rapidity of movement of the vehicles, which are known as trains. At intervals of from to 10 miles there are stopping places, called stations, each ruled by a prince, who bears the title of station master. A train was waiting one day at a Senane station, and I was standing by one of the carriage doors preparatory to getting in, when an exceedingly rude or drunken station master came along and tried to make me get into another compartment, which contained a number of Negroes, on the ground that I belonged there. We came to high words over the affair, and I had just raised my arm intending to clinch my argument by a sound box on his ears, when the whistle sounded and the train was off. As my arm descended we had already gone 6 miles and had arrived at the next station, where my hand struck against the cheek of the unoffending station master, who I was standing near. I was obliged to beg the poor man's forgiveness, and apologies are what I particularly detest. Many other things are different in America from here: the people, the animals, and even the elements. It is impossible to form any idea of the magnitude of an American storm. I went on a visit to a friend in Illinois, who had emigrated to America some 20 years previously and started farming on a large scale, but without conspicuous success. During my stay there a terrible storm arose, which tore up all the buildings and tossed the heavy wooden beams into the air like feathers. Naturally, all the inmates of the including 60 Negroes and 40 Indians, were carried away too, and we noticed that 2 stone wells on the estate were torn out of the ground. The hurricane carried us about 10 miles and set us down on a where we found all the animals and the various parts of the buildings in good condition. We at once set to work to rebuild, and within a week the new farm was ready for occupation. The most remarkable thing was the reappearance of the 2 stone wells, which had been torn up and planted here by the wind. Yielding to an irresistible impulse, I walked up to the pump handles and pulled them vigorously, with the stream at once gushed out. "That has happened, Munchausen," cried my friend. "Is it possible that the water in the wells has iron carried here too?" But I stepped back hastily, for the liquid was not water but petroleum, which is almost universally used in America for lamps, as it burns with a brighter flame than any other oil. No one had known hitherto of the existence of this petroleum spring, which of course was now the property of my friend, and when I was in New York a few months later, I was delighted at receiving a letter from him, in which he said that the spring was working day and night, and that he was on the road to becoming a millionaire. Here you see exemplified the truth of the old proverb, "It's an ill wind that blew us nobody go ciel." In the West Indies I once experienced almost as violent a storm as this one. A friend of mine was leaving his house one stormy day when the wind unbuttoned his waterproof cloak from top to bottom. He turned round quickly to enter his house again, when the wind buttoned his cloak again, but it carried off his hat, and did not return it. You see for yourselves that this strange tale must be true, however improbable it sounds, or else how could it possibly have happened? With these words the Baron opened the door and walked out. His audience, somewhat surprised at his hasty departure, listened with regret to his rapid footsteps. But they heard him return muttering in RXED tones, "I have forgotten something." Then he walked in and said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I have been on the point of asking you 20 times if I ever told you a tale about my friend, General Konski, whose acquaintance I made in Warsaw." All shook their heads, and the Baron, walking up to the table, began somewhat hurriedly, still standing. "This general offered his services to his country at the beginning of the Russo-Turkish War, and was given the command of a large body of troops. He encamped on the Turkish a few miles away from a small town. I with my hussars was quartered in a neighbouring village awaiting orders. Early one morning as I was roaming through I met a peasant driving a kin containing some empty sacks. He was going out in search of filberts, of which his master's wife was extremely fond, and as I had nothing in particular to do I offered to accompany him. We found in abundance of these nuts, which are not much to my taste. Naturally, we had to leave the cart while we plucked them, but we returned at intervals and stuffed them in the sacks. We had already half filled the sacks and were busily engaged at some distance from the cart, when we heard a strange noise, and looking up, saw a gigantic bear, which, scenting its fire-right nuts, had climbed on the wagon, and was calmly sitting there scooping out handle ones of nuts from the nearest sack and putting them in his mouth. The peasant opened his eyes and mouth to their fullest extent, and I cried out, "Fool that I was to leave my gun in the cart," for the bear was standing close by us, and as I spoke he calmly looked round and helped himself to some more nuts. The peasant was speechless with horror, but he soon recovered his senses and called out to his horse in Walloon, "Hi there! Gee up!" The horse at once began to trot down the road, and the bear, who did not care for the jolting, commenced growling ominously. This was of course the best means of inciting the terrified brute to greater speed, and when the smooth high road was reached, he galloped madly to the camp, with the bear standing upright in the cart and giving vent to the most feral growls. Now the troops were at that moment awaiting the arrival of General Konski, who had arranged to come over and inspect them that morning, and were drawn up in martial array. Hundreds of spectators were present, gazing eagerly at the brilliant sight. A cloud of dust was seen on the highway. The trumpeters sounded a loud blast and all prepared to salute. As the cloud of dust drew nearer and the sound of wheels was distinctly heard, the commanding officer cried, "Here is the general," and gave the signal. 1,000 voices shouted simultaneously, 3 cheers for General Konski. Hip, hip, hurrah! In the midst of the shouts the horse galloped up and fell exhausted to the ground. Among the half-filled sacks stood the bear, growling ferociously. Exerting all our strength, the peasant and I had raced after the triumphal procession, but naturally I had outstripped him. I came up quite out of breath, and the cart just as it came to a standstill. With one hand I gripped the monster's shorn tail, and as I did so the voices cried once more, "Hulta for the general!" Then I gave the tail a violent jerk, which dashed the Irar to the ground and broke his neck and all his ribs. All the music and shouting came to an abrupt end, and a dead silence prevailed, only broken by the officer's exclamation, "Surely, Baron Munchausen, this is not His Excellency, General Konski. No, sir, this is a Irar and some filberts." When the laughter of his listeners had subsided, the Baron concluded with a courtly and added as he turned to go, "To the best of my belief the bear was stuffed as a punishment for having tried to pass himself off as the general, and is to be seen at Kiev to the present day. Should any of you chance to go there, you will doubtless find him in the Natural History Museum." With these parting words the Baron concluded his veracious adventures and bade the assembled company good night. The end.